If you want to know what the strongest and weakest altered TCG starter decks are, then you're in the right place. Let's jump into it. What's up everyone, it's Dan with Maindeck, and today we are going to be doing a tier list of the 6 starter decks in Altered TCG's first set, Beyond the Gates. I've seen a lot of people asking for recommendations on which starter deck to get, and I'm going to start this out by saying this tier list is like mostly for fun. We're going to use some sort of like objective kind of stats-based analysis to kind of give you what the overall strongest and weakest are, but what you really should do is pick the faction that appeals the most to you. And for every faction, we'll do a brief explanation of kind of what goes into that faction, what they're about, and what makes them stronger or weaker on the list. And also keep in mind, this isn't a blanket, this faction is this strength. This is purely based on what comes in the starter decks, which are designed to give you an introductory thematic experience, and not necessarily to make the game like particularly oppressive or anything, just not really do anything crazy that you can probably do when you start to build a deck in your favorite faction in the full game. So without any further ado, we have 6 decks, we have 6 tiers. We're going to just put one deck in each tier. That means some of these are going to look a little sadder than others, but really at the end of the day, none of these they're not like that far apart. It's not like some of the decks can't ever win against the ones that are higher or anything. A lot of play skill goes into it, and I don't know, everything. It's just a tier list. Don't take it too seriously. All right, so let's start out. Our first deck we're going to be placing on here is, well, you know what? We're just going to go top down. We're going to start with our S+ tier starter deck, and the starter deck that goes in S+ tier is going to be Ordis. If you are looking for the strongest starter deck out of the box, the most consistent win rates, the blue faction Ordis is going to be the best choice for you. Now, the reason for that is that this deck is in some ways simply the most forgiving deck of any of them. The Ordis deck plays a token-based strategy. It is led by Yzmir and Wingspan as its hero, who has a very simple, very powerful, very consistent ability, which is all of those are things that are not necessarily the case with each of the other heroes in the starter decks. Yzmir and Wingspan simply puts out a 1/1/1 Ordis Cadet token into your hero expedition every single turn, and by that you can kind of tell that the theme of this deck is tokens, tokens, and more tokens. The Ordis deck wins just by flooding the board with lots of tokens, and that means that this deck is not as susceptible to removal. This deck can play pretty flexibly, putting things all over the place, so it can kind of move around and never has to usually commit too much to any one side, and has some extremely powerful plays with cards like Charge that will just blast a ton of stats onto the board really fast to close the game out. In the wider game, of course, there are more answers to this, but in the starter deck metagame, all of the decks will have a fight on their hands against Ordis, and Ordis, just due to its ability to consistently always have those stats out and play in a pretty straightforward manner, just see stats, play stats, put them on the board. It makes Ordis just the most forgiving, simplest, most straightforward deck where you can really squeeze the most power out of it with the least experience going in. If you want to give a new player a deck where they have a pretty decent shot of actually winning the game by their own merit, the Ordis deck is a perfect choice for that. Now for our S tier deck, we're going to place the Bravos deck in S tier, although realistically between S+, S, A, and possibly even B, I can see arguments for any of them hitting S tier. Well, pretty much everyone will agree that Ordis should be at the top. I think there is some debate about what goes in these sort of slightly lower tiers. I like Bravos though, and the reason I like Bravos is a lot like Ordis, it's a fairly straightforward deck. It's a stat-based deck. Bravos' thing is having big stats, but not necessarily always having as much sort of longevity or ability to go as wide as Ordis does. And that means that it is still a fairly straightforward game plan, but it is a little more susceptible to things like removal, interaction. And if you just straight look at the heroes, Kojo and Buddha is a lot like Yzmir and Wingspan in that it's going to put a token into play, except instead of getting a 1/1/1 in your hero expedition every turn, you get a 2/2/2 every other turn in your companion expedition. And the every other turn things means there is a little more foresight that goes into playing this. You need to be able to predict a little bit better what you're going to need to do to optimize the turns when you don't have Buddha in play, and then try to figure out how to, get the most value out of the turns where you do get a little boost of energy with that 2/2/2. Sometimes you may have to actually not play out your hand and play out the right cards and kind of plot around your opponent a little more. It's just not quite as straightforward as Ordis, but it is still a very simple, very easy deck for people to pick up and start to understand right away the raw power of just putting big stats on the board and winning the game quickly. So it is another great deck for newer players, can be very competitive with Ordis and with the A tier deck here as well. Those three, I think, kind of make up the trifecta of some of the stronger decks in the altered starter deck metagame, and they're all pretty, they have wins and losses against each other pretty equally, with Ordis just being a hint above the other ones for sure. So our A tier deck is going to actually be Muna, my favorite faction, and the Muna deck is the deck that I think out of the top three is going to be, of course, a little bit harder to play, but when it's played well, I think it can easily beat the Bravos deck and could be S tier. But the thing about the Muna deck is it just is so much more easily blown out than Bravos is. So again, where Ordis is playing a lot of small things to the board and removal doesn't do a lot, Bravos is playing a number of bigger things, efficient, powerful things to the board where your stats can easily get wiped out, but you actually have a lot more that you can play there. And the Muna deck is trying to do usually one thing in particular, which is just to go really tall with units that have anchored, that can then get big and sit in play for several turns, which means a blowout removal spell can totally shift the Muna game plan. Now, the thing about Muna is that's not the only way to play the deck, but that's the way a lot of people hone into right away. And there are matchups where you want to go wider, and there are matchups where you want to go taller, and part of playing Muna well and more effectively is starting to understand what removal you're going to run into and what your opponent's goal is in every game or even just every turn. That helps you play the deck quite a bit more effectively. Muna is led by Teja and Naura, who is a hero that allows you to put a +1/+1/+1, a boost counter on the first character you play every turn. And that ability is quite strong. It's got the same rough strength as Sigismar and Wingspan, except you do have to play a character to get it, and it has to be your first character, which means sometimes you kind of want to bait out plays by playing small things, and then you would like to have that boost token on a character you play later in the turn, but you just don't have that option. So she does sort of guide your play in a particular way, which is somewhat good for newer players, but also means you're a little more susceptible to getting blown out by that, because she'll say, well, you want to put it on your Cone Man because that's going to get anchored down. And when you play your big thing out first, then your opponent has the opportunity to kind of react to it. So sometimes she guides you in a way that actually is less optimal to play, which can lead to more of those blowout losses. So that's why Muna ranks just slightly below Bravos and Ordis, although I think if you play with it a bunch, understand the interaction, it is a lot easier to start to rack up wins with it in the Star deck metagame. It is definitely a strong deck, and a lot of fun to, in my opinion, to learn all that strategy with. So our B tier deck is going to be Axiom. And I think Axiom is one of the most controversial decks in the starter decks. The Axiom deck is all about building a machine of these contraptions, these landmarks that are going to start to make you value every turn, or one-shot landmarks that'll make you value, and then you want to get rid of them for something else in the future. And every time you play a landmark with your hero, Sierra and Oddball, if it has 3 cost or higher, you're going to get to rest her in order to make a brass bug token. So she actually can make a 2/2/2 when you play a landmark, and that allows you to kind of put the big problem with landmarks, and one of the struggles with this deck that makes it a little tougher to play and puts it a little lower on the list, is that playing a landmark takes up your turn when you don't get to commit anything to the board, which gives the opportunity for the opponent to actually take both sides or push you out of one side that where you committed a small amount to or something. And that means you really have to get to the later game and get that build up to pay off. And any deck requiring you to actually play well to get to a later game in order to get the payoffs to turn on is naturally going to be a deck that doesn't win quite as often, especially when you're doing low skill players versus higher skill, more experienced players. And Axiom is it's simply because of that is a trickier deck to play. Now, Sierra and Oddball is nice because she does allow you to still commit stuff to the board by getting that brass bug token when you're playing those landmarks. And that definitely shores up the deck's play a little bit. Without that, this deck would be quite a bit more difficult to play, as some of the other Axiom constructed decks can be, but that allows you to kind of keep putting things on the board, and it's pretty straightforward to see. You want the brass bug hives. These things are crazy. You're going to use the brass bug hubs in order to get there and get some more brass bugs out there in the earlier game. But once you get those hives out there, then you start churning out the bugs, and then things start to feel quite a bit easier. It does have some good interaction, some sabotage, some other removal types that are allow it to compete with decks like Muna and Bravos a little better. But it does struggle, comparing the Axiom deck versus the Ordis deck. The Ordis deck feels like it gets a lot of what the Axiom deck's trying to do, just kind of for free or easier. And that's just the nature of how these starter decks are built. But if you're someone who likes the invention theme and likes to build up sort of a Rube Goldberg device of a bunch of artifacts that are going to make value for you, then the Axiom deck is going to be a ton of fun for you to play. And it is certainly one where once it gets going, it can outpace any of the decks on the list, just depending on how your play skill is and how your game goes. Now in the C tier, it hurts me, but hear me out on this one. I'm going to put Lyra in the C tier. I think there was no place for Lyra to go other than towards the bottom, simply because of the perception people have when they jump into the deck, and, frankly, how the deck sometimes can actually actively hurt you compared to some of the other heroes on the list. The Lyra deck is led by Nevenka and Blotch, and Lyra is the faction of sort of free-spiritedness and artistry and gambling and chaos. And the Lyra deck embodies that fully with a hero who allows you to, every turn, you may choose to use her ability to roll a die, to potentially either anchor a character into place so it stays the next turn, put a boost on a character so that it gets a little stronger, or lose that character to your reserve entirely when you roll a 1. And I have plenty of stories of losing the most important character I had to that 1 when it was either like, if I rolled anything but the 1, I won the game. I rolled the 1, I lose the game. Well, I rolled the 1. So a lot of people look at this Lyra deck and immediately assume, oh, okay, it's a big randomness game, it doesn't matter, just roll your dice, see what happens. And I think you certainly can play it that way, but that is not the optimal way to play the deck. Unfortunately, that's the way a lot of people play the deck, which I think a lot of people might even rank this deck at the very bottom of the list because of that. But Lyra has one interesting thing going for it, which is that the Lyra stats are often higher in the stats that they have, but as a trade-off for that, one of their stats is a 0. So for example, you can see some of the characters I'm showing here are like that. Pretty much all the characters in the deck are like that. There are strategic ways to play with these stats that actually allow you to get a lot more advantage out of that than using it as a disadvantage, but it requires a ton of foresight. So what I like to tell people is Lyra is the deck that looks like it's pure chaos, but it's actually a highly skillful dance to try and get the right stats in the right place at the right time. That takes a little bit of experience to get used to, honestly. Because once you progress past the starting spot on the map tiles, then you and your opponent are actively vying for a smaller number of stats every single turn. And if you can line up these 4/0/4s, for example, to be blocking your opponent and progressing you at the same time, based on where everyone is placed on the map, then suddenly you're paying smaller amounts for higher stats, and that 0 doesn't really matter. So by playing into that strength of Lyra and by only using the Nevenka ability when it's actually important to use it, you can minimize the randomness and maximize your power, and actually you can pull off some pretty surprising victories against these other decks on this list. I, for one, have actually won against Ordis with Lyra in a tournament setting, and it was quite magnificent seeing our team come together and find ways to beat the strongest deck. So just like I said, this is not a definitive ranking where like the C tier will never beat Ordis, but I do think it takes a little bit more skill and experience to do that, and sometimes you're still just going to lose the die roll, which means because there's the die roll aspect to this, there's no way that I can put it higher than towards the bottom of the list, unfortunately. But of course, when you get to the full game, there are different ways to play Lyra that don't involve dice rolls at all, so make sure to explore those and have a lot of fun with what is honestly one of the most fun factions in the game. And then finally, in C- tier is Yzmir, unfortunately, and Yzmir is such a cool faction. It is one of my favorites. It is the control faction, the faction of wizards and magic, and it's led by Akesha and Taru, and I don't know why I didn't say this when I was recording the video in the first place, but I'm just going to jump in and let you guys know a little bit about Akesha and Taru. They are a super cool leader who allows you to after you your opponent, which is something where a lot of people read it for the first time and they're like, how is that even good? But it's actually extremely good when there's no soft passing and altered. You either have to play your card or pass. So when you after you your opponent, you force them to start playing first. and then you could see where they go. And if they build up on one side, you can sneak in on the other, or you can force them to play out all of their things, and then you can choose the juiciest target to use your removal on. It is exactly what you want a removal leader to have. It is a really cool power, and if you're a control fan, you should definitely look at that just for Akesha and Taru alone. But it's at the bottom of the list. Why is the Yzmir deck at the bottom of this list? I have a little speculation that I think that the team at Equinox decided to make sure that the Yzmir deck, as sort of the control deck of the bunch, was not overly oppressive against some of the other decks that are the other starter decks that exist, because that could give people a pretty negative perception of the game right away when they feel like they can't do anything. So the Yzmir deck is a little more reined in, has more characters than it maybe necessarily needs to have, and because of that, it has trouble. It goes slow. It answers some things, but it has struggles with decks that go wide. You have the Ordis deck that goes wide. The Bravos deck can go a little wider. The Axiom deck can go absolutely wide once it gets its stuff built up. Lyra can go super wide too, has a lot of low-cost things, and even Muna can go wide. And when your opponent goes fast or goes wide, the Yzmir deck has a lot more trouble keeping up because all of its units are just lower stats. And the starter deck just simply doesn't have the tools that it would need to deal with that. That said, if you enjoy playing control strategies, this is certainly a deck where you can like completely blow out Muna if they play into you wrong or just don't draw the right cards. Same with Bravos, same with Axiom. You can get rid of their permanents and stop them from getting things built up. Same with Lyra. When they get a strong Asmodeus on the board, you can just get rid of it. And the Yzmir deck has the most access to effects like that, which makes it a very fun deck for the right player who likes that kind of thing. You just have to know going into it, based on how the starter decks are built, it just has a little less juice than it might need to get over that finish line and close the game out, which puts it at, unfortunately, a C-. That said, again, it can beat all of these decks. It totally can. But just overall, people are going to get fewer wins with a lower skill level with the Yzmir deck than they would with some of the more simple, straightforward decks higher on the list, which is why it goes right at the bottom of the list. So, with that all said, that is my tier list. If you disagree or agree, I would love to hear in the comments down below. What do you think about the strongest and weakest starter decks? What's been your experience playing them? And have you had any absolute upsets where decks that you thought were weaker were able to beat the stronger ones on the list? I know that happens all the time. Again, this is not a definitive power ranking. It's just supposed to help guide you along into what deck should you start with, should you play with, and which deck should you give your newer player that you're teaching the game. I hope this helps guide you on your journey at the start of Altered TCG. I hope you found this interesting. Thank you guys so much for watching. We'll have more Altered content coming soon. As the game is releasing, we're all super excited about it here. I've been building decks. We will have deck techs coming, all that kind of good stuff. So make sure to stay tuned to that. Let me know if you like this one. Thank you so much for watching, and we'll see you guys in the next one.